Welcome to La Habana, Cuba. This is From the Sanctioned Seat. By now, you must be wondering, if legal travel exists and the rules are knowable, then why do so many people, why do so many institutions, why do universities, why do organizations hesitate to travel to Cuba? And the answer isn't that Cuba is dangerous. The answer is that it's about risk management. Current trends amplify the perception of risk, and even though the risk itself hasn't been elevated, there is a perception of risk that has been far more elevated than the reality. This episode of From the Sanctioned Seat, I wanted to look a little bit deeper into what is risk management when it comes to travel to Cuba. My name is Melisa Rivière. I'm an anthropologist and a certified sanctions specialist. This series exists to break down Cuba sanctions so that we can better understand legal travel to Cuba. And today's episode is going to look at risk management and how we deal with the gap between what is legal and what is operational. So as we've seen in other episodes prior to this one, the American Cars is the home of From the Sanctioned Seat, because it's in these 1950s relics of the past that leave the story behind of U.S. sanctions on Cuba. They document, they are the movement of sanctions on Cuba. Now, a fun fact, these cars here in Cuba are called almendrones. They're called almendrones because they look like and have the shape of almonds. Now, why almonds? So, as it turns out, in the 1950s, the clay that was used to make the body and the shape of these cars to look like almonds was made by hand. It used a combination of oil, wax, and sulfur. And it molded these cars by hand to make these almond-shaped appearance. So that design was engineered and pioneered by a lead designer at General Motors called Earl Harley. He wanted his cars to be different than the city cars that were popular up until then, that were more boxy. He wanted his cars to be longer, wider, and lower, and for them to look like they hugged the road. And in fact, it was at the same time, around 1956, that the Highway Act passed, in which there was a motivation that cars would now not only move you around the city, but they would cover long distances throughout the country. See, the word sanctions, it sounds so absolute that it makes the risk sound extreme. And then there's the elevated perception of risk that doesn't always align with the reality of risk. In reality, most risk actually comes from the misunderstanding of requirements, the unpredictable presidential administrations, inconsistent compliance operations, lack of institutional experience, operational blockades that comes from banks or from insurance companies, and a cash-only economy because of the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Credit cards can't be used here. So these aspects all elevate what we consider the perception of risk, even though they may not actually elevate risk itself. So legal risk decreases when systems are structured, supervised, monitored, and routinely exercised. One major source of confusion comes from the U.S. State Department's travel advisory levels. We looked at these in a previous episode, and now we're going to break them down a little more. These advisories rank countries worldwide on 4 levels, ranging from exercise normal precautions all the way to do not travel. A travel advisory is not a legal prohibition. It does not make travel illegal. It does not override OFAC regulations either. Travel advisories are risk communication tools. They assess conditions such as health infrastructure, crime, political constraints, or strained bilateral relations, not a unique or exceptional danger compared to other countries at the same level. Cuba is at a level 2 since 2018. Level 2 is exercised increased caution. In 2018, it came down from a level 3, which was reconsider travel. Today, it stands at a level 2. But there's many other countries at the same level 2 that I can name to you where travel is very common. Let's say, for example, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Thailand, Denmark, Costa Rica, Spain, the Maldives Islands, Morocco, China, Thailand, Brazil, Uruguay. So many countries have a level 2. So why do we consider it more risky to come to Cuba? And that has to do with the perception of risk, not the actual risk itself. because clearly the Department of State is saying that it's just as safe to go to Cuba as it is to go to Italy. So one of the reasons that risk feels inflated is because all these agencies that we looked at in a previous episode that handle U.S. Cuba sanctions and handle U.S. legal travel to Cuba all get blurred into one. You have the U.S. Congress that codified the embargo into law in 1996 under the Helms-Burton Law. You have the U.S. State Department that issues the travel advisories, the travel levels, threat levels that we just looked at. You have the Office of Foreign Assets Controls that administers the economic sanctions. You have various presidential decrees that either modify or expand or contract OFAC exemptions. You have the U.S. Treasury Department that focuses and handles civil enforcement. And lastly, you have Customs and Border Protection that manages the exit and the re-entry of U.S. citizens and those under U.S. jurisdiction who travel to Cuba from the United States or from anywhere in the world. And as you can see, each of these agencies has a different role. When travelers, programs, institutions collapse all of these functions into one single imagined authority, the uncertainty grows. Not because enforcement is aggressive, no, but because responsibilities are so precise, and that makes them oftentimes misunderstood. Legal travel to Cuba is not confusing because it's abstract. It's confusing because it's so specific. So why do universities, organizations, and travelers hesitate? They don't fear the travel to Cuba itself. What they actually fear is unclear documentation, financial exposure, reputational misunderstanding, inconsistent guidance, poorly trained insurance representatives or compliance officers unfamiliar with the Cuban Assets Control regulations. Remember our CACRs? Those often compound the issue. When sanctions are poorly explained, decision makers default to caution. The precision creates uncertainty, and uncertainty elevates our perception of risk. So when we talk about precision, I'm going to reference something like another source of hesitation, which is the existence of U.S. State Department maintained lists. The Cuba Restricted Entities List that was published in 2017 under the first Trump administration is a list that includes Cuban government and military affiliated companies, agencies, and organizations with which U.S. citizens and those under U.S. jurisdiction are prohibited from engaging in direct financial transactions with. The intent is to prevent U.S. funds from supporting the Cuban military, intelligence, and security services sector. This includes entities in sectors such as tourism, retail, infrastructure that are controlled by the Cuban military. When the list came out in 2017, one of the stores on the list was La Casa del Abanico, the House of the Hand Fan. So today, the House of the Hand Fan is now restricted. U.S. citizens and those under U.S. jurisdiction may not purchase a hand fan at the House of the Hand Fan. But this is where I'm talking about risk management. How can you identify a hand fan that is allowed from one that is prohibited? That's what makes elevated risk and institutions hesitate, because it becomes so difficult to learn and study the details. The second list that we need to look at and we always need to abide by is the Cuba Prohibited Accommodations list. This one was published in 2020. The list identifies hotels and lodging facilities in Cuba that are owned and controlled by the Cuban government, specifically the military or the security services. U.S. travelers are prohibited from staying in any of these accommodations, and I simply recommend not to stay at hotels. Instead, you stay at casa particulares in order to not only abide by U.S. sanctions on Cuba, but I guarantee you even have a better experience of more people-to-people contact at a privately owned, run casa particular, which is like a bed and breakfast run by a Cuban family. The goal of the prohibited accommodations list, just like the restricted entities list, is to ensure that U.S. travel and related spending supports the Cuban people rather than the state-run entities. Now, these lists are updated periodically. In fact, the most recent one was updated in July of 2025, just last year. These updates to the restricted entities and the prohibited accommodations lists are not signals of imminent danger. They're just part of routine sanctions maintenance. The lists do not prohibit travel to Cuba. They regulate with whom U.S. citizens and those under U.S. jurisdiction can have transactions, financial transactions with, including certain state affiliated entities and specific hotels or properties. A traveler can be in Cuba legally and still violate sanctions by booking the wrong hotel or making the wrong payment to a restricted entity or buying a beautiful fan in the wrong place. So, how does OFAC enforcement actually occur? Well, Cuba sanctions enforcement tends to be retroactive, not permission based, as we saw in a previous episode. OFAC does not stop travelers at the airport. On the return to the United States from Cuba, the agency that you are going to encounter is Customs and Border Protection, or Homeland Security. Their role is border control, it is not sanctions licensing. OFAC enforcement occurs after the fact, after you've returned from travel. Typically, it can happen when something triggers a question, an inquiry, an audit, perhaps an inconsistency, a reporting issue, or frozen funds because you sent money to a family in Spain who was renting the house to you in Cuba. So these are the things that can trigger audits after the fact. You might be asked by Customs and Border Protection or Homeland Security upon departure why you're traveling to Cuba, which general license category you're using, but that's not where sanctions licensing occurs. Compliance, therefore, is not about avoiding scrutiny. Compliance is precisely about being prepared for it. Sanctions do not reward improvisation. They reward systems. Travel operators should have clear itinerary, clearly defined objectives, transparent financial records. Responsible travel operators need to maintain detailed archives, audit trails, and receipts. And every travel operator should have a clearly documented sanctions compliance program. And you should be able to ask to read it. So, what are your key takeaways from today's episode? Well, one, that travel to Cuba is legal, and that compliance requires structure, that operational experience matters, and that understanding and managing risk is imperative. You must have, and your travel operators must have, a solid and well articulated sanctions compliance program that monitors legal travel and all its changes in real time. So, yes, travel to Cuba is legal. And if you want to sponsor organization that successfully manages the gap between what is legal and what is operational, well then you should come to Cuba with Son Dos Alas. A ver, Miguel, cuéntame un poquito de este carro. ¿Cuál es el año, el modelo, la marca?
Bueno, el coche es un Ford Fireland del 1957. Ya no cuenta con su mecánica original, tiene un motor de Toyota.
Miguel, cuando yo estaba grabando aquí, me di cuenta que esta caja es mecánica, no es automática. ¿Y me puedes contar un poquito de eso? ¿Cómo vino esto y cómo lo has tenido que adaptar?
Bueno, normalmente vienen con una caja tercera manual. Ya esta que tiene es la original del Toyota, que tiene su caja de cambio arriba, pero son 5 velocidades. Todo es adaptaciones cubanas, ingeniería cubana, como decimos acá.
¿Y este carro originalmente era diésel o gasolina?
Estos venían originales a gasolina, con su motor V8, que gastan mucho combustible. Normalmente vienen haciendo sobre los 5 o 6 kilómetros por litro. Ya esto con un motor diésel de Toyota, que es el que tiene, oscila sobre los 12 kilómetros, 13 kilómetros por un litro, es mucho más económico.
Alguna gente piensa que estos carros se mantienen vivos por el cariño que se les da, pero ¿cuántas veces hay que reparar estos carros?
No. Y más en la parte de La Habana, donde estamos, el salitre es muy agresivo. Ya, si ven algunos detalles, ya hay que empezar ya a volver a restaurar toda la parte de la chapa, de la pintura.
¿Podemos abrir el capó y mirar adentro?
Vamos para allá.
A ver, Miguel, cuéntame un poquito de qué tenemos acá.
Acá el motor es el de Toyota. Lo que es el radiador, la parte de enfriamiento es la original del coche. El sistema de freno es el original de esta parte de acá, pero los frenos son pinzas de freno. Ya es todo readaptado más modernos.
Ok, aquí tenemos el motor Toyota.
Toyota motor,
Japán.
Motor y ya de ahí para allá la caja. Que las adaptaciones, esta parte de acá es la adaptación de las varillas. Es muy complicado poderlo adaptar al timón. Poder adaptar las 5 velocidades al timón es bien complicado.
¿Y cómo es eso? ¿Cómo adaptás lo
Bueno,
que es las partes antiguas originales con estas otras partes más modernas y de totalmente otra marca de carro?
esto es mucho trabajo de mecánica, mucho trabajo de tornería. Soy tornero y soy mecánico. Incluido también
ahí está.
y siempre es complicado para hacer, pero al final se hace muchas piezas. Se hacen en la parte de la tornería que son específicamente para cada tipo de carro, ¿sabes? No es una producción que hagan los torneros acá.
Claro.
Cada carro tiene, ¿por qué? Porque, por ejemplo, puede que tengan los discos de freno de Toyota, las pinzas de Hyundai, y entonces hay que hacer muchas adaptaciones acá. Y todo eso se hace en la parte de tornería.
Una cosa se distingue también de este carrito es la pintura.
Sí.
Cuéntame un poquito de la chapistería para este carro, cómo se vuelve a hacer o sea, las formas tan únicas que tiene, tan redondeadas, cuando tenés algún tipo de...
Ya esto, chapista y la pintura es un trabajo bien complicado para poder lograr que quede en línea. Y ahí ya es conjunto el chapista con el pintor.
El color es espectacular.
Sí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Miguel. Muchísimas gracias por dejarnos filmar From the Sanctioned Seat.